So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for what I know is sure to be a really engaging session. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Gary, I wanted to go through a few housekeeping rules. First, since this is a webinar format, the audience members will not be visible or audible to the panelists, but we do encourage you to engage with the panelists by asking questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This webinar will also be recorded and will be posted to the Hastings Center website later today. I will go ahead and invite our panelists to join us, and we'll hand it off to Dr. Mercer Gary, a presidential scholar at the Hastings Center and an incoming assistant professor of philosophy at Drexel University. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us in this first webinar in a series on generative artificial intelligence and its implications for healthcare and science. I'm joined today by Dr. Illah Nourbakhsh and Dr. Shannon Vallor. Dr. Nourbakhsh is Kavchik Mora Professor of Robotics at Carnegie Mellon University, where he is also Executive Director of the Center for Shared Prosperity and Director of the CREATE Lab at the Robotics Institute. He is also a fellow of the Hastings Center. Holding a PhD in computer science, Dr. Nourbakhsh is the author of several monographs, including AI and Humanity and Robot Futures, both with MIT Press, along with dozens of journal articles. Dr. Vallor is the Baillie Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh's Edinburgh Futures Institute, where she directs the Center for Technomoral Futures and is also a professor of philosophy. She's the author of Technology and the Virtues, a philosophical guide to a future worth wanting, and a forthcoming book entitled The AI Mirror, Rebuilding Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking, in addition to dozens of journal articles. Today, we're going to be talking about caregiving across several settings, including professionalized healthcare, long-term residential care, and home care, as well as unpaid informal assistance with activities of daily living. We're interested in how advances in artificial intelligence may impact the work and lives of people in need of care and the healthcare providers, other paid workers, and unpaid community members who attend to their needs. Multiple senses of care are relevant here. If we take a basic definition to include all forms of assistance that promote the fulfillment of basic human needs, a number of caregiving activities come to mind. Some of these are physical, assistance in feeding, clothing, bathing, and toileting, as well as specialized medical assistance for treating wounds, injuries, and long-term conditions. Other tasks are primarily logistical, assisting in preparing meals and living spaces, arranging transportation, keeping track of appointments, medications, and routines. A third set of activities are less tangible and more relational, providing company, emotional support, expressions of concern, and empathy to respond to social and emotional needs. AI-driven technologies are already active in pretty much all of the areas listed in at least some locations. The so-called contemporary crisis of care in the United States and other high-income countries has prompted increasing investment in technologies designed to assist people while easing the burden on human caregivers. Major drivers of this crisis include the rise in mental health concerns, climate catastrophe, and population aging. For instance, as the US population ages and generational cohorts shrink, the increase in older adults' needs for care is projected to be met with a smaller population capable of providing that care. But in addition to describing a kind of labor and a kind of relationship, feminist ethicists have long contended that care is also a unique moral attitude and a source of ethical insight. They argue that treating someone with care may look different than treating them with respect, another moral attitude. Where respect often means giving due deference to someone based on their status as an autonomous human, care instead attends to the other in their particularity. It requires attunement to the specific projects, dispositions, and desires of this particular person. The integration of AI into the work of care thus also raises significant questions about the ethical value of care, in addition to its effective delivery. Despite the recent dramatic increase in public interest, these questions aren't entirely new. The debate over whether and how AI should care for humans has been ongoing for some time, and AI-driven devices already use machine learning to respond to user questions, offer reminders, deliver medications, and jumpstart scientific research. Recent and anticipated advances in AI, however, have the potential to increase the sophistication of AI-powered interventions in caregiving significantly. The current exploding public interest in generative AI has centered on ChatGPT, which OpenAI made using the large language model GPT 3.5 and became popular with the public as a chat interface where users can submit detailed prompts dictating the topic and style of conversation, to which the model responds by synthesizing relevant available text. At the most basic level, the model is predicting associations, such as the series of words that are most likely to follow from the prompt based on the data available, and generating text in response. Importantly, because ChatGPT does not sort out unreliable data, what it presents is a compilation rather than an evaluated answer. Training data has therefore been the focus of much criticism, especially regarding the duplication and entrenchment of racial, gender, and ability bias through AI use. Furthermore, where AI systems use the data they generate as part of its own training materials, concerns about reliability increase. This is just some background for our conversation, which I'm excited to get started. And I want to begin by asking our panelists a couple of questions, and then we'll move to Q&A with the audience. As a reminder, audience members are encouraged to ask questions via Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. So Dr. Vallor and Dr. Nourbakhsh, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
It seems both in the public conversation and in individual conversations I've seen take place that some of the squeamishness around these uses of AI in the care sector seem to be tied to our understanding of care as something like an essential feature of being human. This becomes especially challenging as AI-powered social robots are at least perceived to appear more human. How does the integration of generative AI change our understanding of care and its significance?
Go ahead.
Well, I'll say I'm not sure that it does or will or should change our understanding of care and its significance. I do think care is sort of a fundamental human good. Much as feminist care ethicists have held, it may even be our first and primary experience of the good, and the one that makes us understand the good as something that's inseparable from our vulnerability to and dependence on one another. So I'm inclined to think that care is about as fundamental as moral concepts get. You know, maybe we can talk about justice and others as having similar claims. So I don't think there's any question about the significance of care. I do think there's a clear ambiguity when we use that term, right? Because we can talk about a caring attitude, or we can talk about caring behavior, or we can talk about care as a need that someone has. And even when we talk about it as a need, we might be talking about a need for a certain kind of emotional concern and caring action, or we might be talking about material needs for care. And so I think a lot of times we don't necessarily all mean the same thing when we use that term. So when we talk about robots caring, right, one of the central questions is, well, what do you mean by that? Do you just mean that they might be able to meet some of the material needs that people have, or even some of the cognitive and social needs for stimulation that people have? Or do you mean that robots will occupy a caring role in a moral and social sense, which is a slightly different thing? So I think there's lots to say about this. I do think generative AI tools have the potential, I think, to make these questions more urgent than they have been. I've been doing this long enough that I remember when everyone was sure that our care homes and schools and hospitals were going to be full of robots by 2015, right? It's like the autonomous vehicle thing, right?
Yeah.
It was always going to be just around the corner, another 5 years. And so, you build up a certain skepticism after you've seen this promise be made over and over again. And as many researchers have shown, many of the deployments of robots in care and social settings have actually been pretty spectacular failures up until this point. But I think one of the interesting questions is generative AI one of the things that's going to allow us to kind of get over some of the obstacles to these robots being accepted and useful? And I have some conflicted feelings about that, but I think I'm going to pause and let Illah come in, and then we'll just continue the conversation from here.
I agree with everything Dr. Vallor just said. Let me go reverse chronology from what she offered, because so the ways in which AI and machine learning and computational data intelligence have been attempted to be shoehorned into caregiving or into just medicine in general, yeah, the spectacular failures are actually worthwhile to read about and to learn about. And what's really interesting is they are on completely different axes of what it means to make a robot, a complex robot. If you think about just the data side, the data processing side, and the reasoning side, I think there's an IEEE Spectrum article that came out a few years ago called How Watson Overpromised and Underdelivered that does a beautiful job of laying out what went completely wrong in all the assumptions technologists make about how clean their data is and how messy the real world is and how spectacularly that causes things not to work out. On the mechanical side, we've talked for how many years? 20 years about how caregivers hurt their backs lifting somebody out of bed. And if we just had some great exoskeletons, then these robots would allow people to do that without hurting their backs. Or maybe even they would help somebody take a bath so we don't have to give them the bath and hurt our body that way. And what we have instead are, $35 million exoskeletons for the military. And we don't have anything that's affordable that could possibly see light of day in a care facility, the managed care facility. And then, yes, there's the mechanical stuff that's not going well. There's the data stuff that's not going well. And so now we have chat, which means, as you correctly pointed out, Dr. Gary, it's statistical. So great. We're going to have a statistical system say the likeliest thing that we might be able to believe. And that's going to make the broken mechanical system and the less than ideal data understanding better. Is we're going to have, falsity and truth mixed together. That's going to solve the problem. What a great Band-Aid. So I think it is funny. I mean, all three of these axes we see basically failure. I also agree with what Dr. Vallor said about the fact that care ought to be a deeply human construct. I do want to talk, though, as we afford decision-making authority or interaction authority to generative AI systems in the future, and it'll happen because we keep trying this stuff. What will that do to our concept of care? And I have kind of just two things I wanted to talk about, two ways of thinking about that. One is fundamental to the concept of agency. I think vulnerability, which Dr. Vallor talked about, is a really important aspect of caregiving and care receiving, showing that you're vulnerable and then being able to do something very human across the gap of vulnerability. But it's interesting, right? In affording care to somebody, you also afford them a kind of agency. You assert your own sense of agency. And so I think the word agency has a lot to do with this sense of autonomy or the derived autonomy we get through that interaction. What's interesting about generative AI or any kind of robotic system is if we start believing in these systems and handing over autonomy to these systems in the caregiving, transpose, what we get, I think, is the possibility of actually reducing both the agency of the caregiver, of the human being who's caregiving, because they're giving out decision-making authority to something else. And at the same time, because it is such a deeply human construct, we may actually reduce the sense of personal agency derived by the one who's being cared for. And I think that's a really interesting issue that we need to think about much more deeply. The other point I'm going to make, which does get to the kind of fictional aspect of ChatGPT, is authority. So there's the two A words for me. So caregiving invests in the person who's giving care a sense of authority. And that means you need trust, right? As a fundamental aspect of care receiving is trusting in them who is giving me care. And there's a huge problem with a system like ChatGPT, because since we know that truth and fiction are completely interlaced together in ways that are impossible to unstick unless you're a content expert, and since we know the one receiving care is probably not a robotics expert or a chat expert, and the caregiver who is human is also probably not a robotics expert or a chat expert or a machine learning expert, neither one has any sense of how much authority they should be vesting into this system. And so it's a big fat unknown. And I think that's a real problem. It's like, okay, we're going to have this system giving care. We don't know how much agency is taking away from us, and we also don't know how much authority to vest into it. So we're kind of stuck in basically a position of uncertainty. And I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you, Dr. Nourbakhsh. That's a really helpful point. I think even in the context of all of these spectacular failures that are numerous and significant, the growing credence in the outputs of this technology is still really notable and creates significant social effects that might potentially impact the way that we think about key concepts, even those as fundamental and human as care. So Dr. Vallor, I'd just be interested to hear you respond to that as well. And thinking about these kinds of challenges that growing attachment to or belief in the power of AI-driven technology might have for how we think about these central human concepts and how we might resist it.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple things. First of all, I'm afraid this might be one of those events where instead of getting your panelists to entertainingly fight with each other, they just agree with each other constantly, because I think I would just add to everything that has been said. One of the real concerns here is the trust relationship and the authority that the caregiver has, but also the power of the recipient of care in many cases. There is a sort of two-way relationship of agency. So the agency isn't just coming from the caregiver, but it's also the agency of the recipient who responds to care in particular ways. And unless they're, for example, in a vegetative state or something like that and unable to respond, for the most part, there's a great deal of importance in thinking about the agency of care recipients and their ability to accept or reject certain kinds of care, to receive it in different kinds of attitudes and spirits, to recognize or not the limits of the caregiver that they may be facing, and also the way that we respond to failures of care. So a lot of times I hear people say things like, I think robots will be better caregivers than people because people are very imperfect caregivers and we fail all the time to care for each other well. Of course, but when humans fall short of the caring ideal, one of the things that happens is we have a response that affects us from that failure. So if I fail you as a friend, as a colleague, or as a caregiver, often I will have something come back at me that I have to deal with in the form of anger, or in the form of protest, or in the form of some recognition of my shortfall, or some blame. And then that's something that helps me over time, potentially, become a better caregiver. So these relationships of trust involve these flows of responsibility and power and vulnerability back and forth. And the idea that care can be this very simple sort of delivery system that we model on the delivery of a product or a service to a consumer or to a buyer fundamentally misunderstands what care is, and the extent to which it's part of the social fabric actually that holds everything together. So I think we have to, first of all, recognize that it's not about treating care as a consumer good, where what we want is the most efficient and costly and most efficient, least costly, and most accessible access to that good, but also how we address what care is and why it matters in society, that it's part of every human experience. I'll just say one more thing, and that is that I think that many years ago in 1976, the computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum, who's famous, of course, for having built the first chatbot, Eliza, the first chatbot to fool people or into becoming attached to it or projecting, anthropomorphizing mental states onto it. So in 1976, he wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason, about the effects of computing and automation on us, on society. And one of the things that he wrote is that the computer revolution, he says, it arrived just in time, but it arrived in time to stall, actually, a lot of social innovation that would have happened if we hadn't had computers there to meet some of the needs of systems that were breaking down, that were being recognized as unjust. And so one of the things I'm thinking about is how much we progressively continue to devalue human care, right? The pay that teachers get, the pay that nurses and human caregivers get, just slides, and the respect that they get, right? Slides further and further south. And what are we doing? Are we seeing this as a crisis that we have to address, as sort of sickness in our society? No, we're talking about, let's get the machines in there. And that's, again, it's exactly what Weizenbaum was talking about. It's a way of stalling the social repair we need to do to our institutions and our kind of cultural values by trying to apply a technological band-aid on top of it. That said, there are places where machines can supplement caregiving and allow it to be, in fact, as rich and as safe and as equitable in its provision as it ought to be. There's a piece for robots in that picture. I actually believe that. But I think that's not, the market doesn't care about building that piece. The market cares about the quick wins that it's seeking, which might be interfering with the parts of care that actually humans need to do.
Thanks so much, Dr. Vallor. That leads us really nicely into this next question, and really touches on a lot of significant work that you both have done. So, as you say, rather than a complete replacement of human caregivers with AI-powered devices, as the kind of hyped up fear gets portrayed, it's much more likely that we'll see AI systems operating alongside human caregivers, though in a wide array of different possible arrangements. We've also had recent increased attention to the kinds of low-wage work, often outsourced towards the developing world, that humans must perform in order for these AI systems to function. So, Professor Nourbakhsh, would you start by explaining some of the more useful ways that humans and AI might collaborate in the care center, and some thoughts on what ethical values should guide those kinds of partnerships?
Sure. So yeah, let's ask the question. Okay, let's suppose we're going to use AI systems in a useful manner, like generative AI systems. What should we do? And I'm going to go on a tangent first and tell a story, because just in the last month, I had dinner with a dean, and then I had a retreat that another dean was at. And the first dean very happily told me that every tenure letter he writes now is written by ChatGPT. And I said, really? Tenure letters, that important recommendation letter you write for a faculty member's promotion, is written by Chat? How do you do that? He said, oh, I just give Chat the CV of the person and their papers, and I tell it to write a good tenure letter for them, and it does. It's great. And I was like, I fell off my chair. I completely fell off my chair. And I asked another dean at this retreat, and they said the same thing, exact same thing, that they've saved hours a week now by doing this. So why does that bother me? And this, I promise we'll go back to care. And it bothers me because what they're saying is, since I gave ChatGPT this cool CV and their paper, it wrote something relevant to that CV, that curriculum vitae in that paper. So it's all good. It's all great. And I asked them both the same question. I said, so, my daughter's looking for an internship. Would you hire her as an intern and have her write your tenure letters for you? And they kind of got stuck. And they got stuck because, well, my daughter, she's like 17 years old. Do I trust her to write a decent letter? I'm going to have to read it really carefully. And man, if I have to read it really carefully and check the facts in it against that CV and that paper, what a waste of time. I might as well have just written that letter myself. And I just thought it was fabulous that they were very untrusting of my daughter, a human being, but yet chat, an alien species, essentially, they don't have a process for auditing the results of what they get from it to even ensure and validate that the truth value of the thing they've created is what it needs to be for whatever they're going to do with it, like helping determine the career future of a human being at another university. So care. One of the most important things is this question of auditability, or you might call it the intern principle. Stop thinking of ChatGPT as some superhuman thing. Think of it as a teenage intern. If you're going to use it as generative AI to do like conversational agent stuff for you and talk to somebody so that it fills in and you can care for more people at the same time because it's having a conversation for you with one of the people that you're caring for. How are you going to audit the quality of the conversation it has? How are you going to make sure that it's reasonable and above threshold? If the answer is you don't know how to do that, then I don't think you can use it. And if you can figure out how to do that and save time, more power to you. That's great. But I don't exactly know how that works. The other issue for me, regardless of auditability, is transparency. I did ask these deans, do they say in their letter that their letter was written by chat? And they said, no, they don't. And that bothers me because somebody else down the road is reading that letter and they really don't know how to disambiguate whether it was written by humans, edited by humans, checked by humans, or written by chat and not checked by humans or whatever. So recently, actually, all my tenure letters I've been writing, I have a little subscript after my signature line that says this letter was written exclusively by human hands. I didn't use chat because I think it's actually a question of transparency now. If you're going to have, we have plenty of distance caregiving happening now already in, for instance, West Virginia, where I do a lot of work. Is the caregiver's intention to let the person they're talking to know, I'm handing you over to my agent, your computer's going to talk to you for a while now while I deal with somebody else? Or was their intention to not say that and just kind of let it slide? I think morally, it's entirely indefensible to not say that, because we have so little confidence in these systems, because we have so little understanding of their long-term behavior. And so I think we have this kind of issue of solving, okay, what's the way in our speech patterns that we're going to point out, I'm actually delivering you over to my computer now. I'm not paying any attention to you at all. Everything you say now, I'm not going to know. So when I talk to you next, you're not going to be able to reference the stuff you're about to say. You're just talking to my conversational agent. It might summarize things for me, but it might not do a great job. So that's a problem. So the fundamental usefulness that I think these systems might have, these generative systems, are if they can generate something for us that's useful that we can review well, audit, and then provide. And if we find that they're useful for that, if they can help us create communication patterns that are of value to people, if you're helping teach somebody in a particular customized situation how to bathe with their spouse and how to have their spouse help them, if there's a neat way for generative AI to help create instructions for that I can review and then I provide it to somebody, great. I have no problems with that. But we need to think about transparency. We need to think about this intern principle, like, is this auditable? And I think we need to think about a whole process for reviewing what's created before we supply what's created to the end user. Those are my three kind of, totems.
Thanks very much for that. Dr. Vallor, I'd love to hear you respond, and also especially to speak to this phenomenon that you've written about, moral de-skilling, which may occur where morally significant tasks, once performed by humans, are increasingly delegated to technology. And I'd love to hear you say a bit more about how we might try to prevent some of that moral de-skilling from happening in this sector.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that when I wrote my first paper on this topic, about the potential for moral descaling around care in particular, there wasn't a lot of research on what care actually teaches us. But since then, there have actually been a number of studies that don't just look at the sort of burdens of care, but they actually look at the benefits of care, meaning the benefits that people get from giving care. And they're profound and considerable in terms of both sort of moral capability, but also social and psychological well-being that comes from effectively giving care. And as I've said, however, in everything I've ever written on this topic, that's what you get when you're actually able to give care, because you're doing it in a supportive environment where you're physically and psychologically protected from grave harm, where you can sleep at night, where you're not going to sacrifice your own health or long-term survival for the care that you have to give. And a lot of people aren't in those circumstances. So I think one of the things to think about is we want to be able to give people the opportunity to receive the benefits of being a caregiver. And that's going to require not taking away opportunities for them to care, but it's also going to require providing a supportive environment for care. So I'll speak from personal experience, but it's an experience that all too many people on this call, I'm sure, have their own experiences with. So my father has severe dementia. We moved him to a care home this April after 3 years of nonstop provision of care by my mother, who is 80 years old and herself not physically strong or in great health. And she gave up so much probably of her future lifespan for those 3 years during a pandemic, so not much support, right, available, even if she could afford it, which she couldn't. And we did everything we could to sort of help. But in the end, it's kind of a miracle that she got through it, actually. And all that she would have needed to care for him at home was the ability to get some sleep through the night, right? To not worry that he was going to get out of bed and endanger himself, to feel like she could turn off for a few hours. And my belief is that, there are potential opportunities for technologies like this that could be very useful. So imagine a scenario where you had some sort of generative AI enabled agent that was smart enough that if a dementia patient woke up in the middle of the night, it could recognize that alertness, it could respond to it, it could ask the right kinds of questions, and it might be able then to have the capacity to know when to alert and awaken a human to attend to this person. Or it might have the capacity in sort of ordinary benign circumstances to sort of soothe the patient and have them eventually, fall back asleep. And for someone like my mother, something like that would have been invaluable to have, right? And there would have been an easy way to sort of monitor the performance of that. You could, in the morning, look at the transcript and see how many times did my husband wake up and what did he say and what did he hear back. And if you weren't confident that the system was responding appropriately, right, you would see that evidence in the transcript and be able to do something about it. So I'm not opposed to very thoughtful designs for these systems, but as we've been talking about, these systems will fail, and we don't currently have the methods for evaluating the failure rate or failure modes of these systems, and we don't have the kind of guardrails for ethical design, development, and deployment of these systems that will allow them to be used safely. But my biggest worry is that there's also just not the economic incentive for something that has this very light touch role in caregiving. The economic incentive is to push the machine in so that you don't have to pay somebody, right? So that you can replace a human. And I'm really not sure where we're going to get the economic incentives to design tools that have this kind of light touch ability to care, where they care, but then they step back and they know not to overextend into places where they're not suited to be.
Thanks very much for that. Oh, please go ahead.
That economic incentive point, I think, is so important. If you just look at self-driving cars, right? The venture capitalists put billions upon billions of dollars into it, but the thing that they funded wasn't, small improvements to how early braking works in Mercedes cars so that you don't get as hurt when you crash. They were doing whole hog, let's replace the human being, no more human. It's $1 trillion marketplace. We're going to turn all that labor income into capital income from some company that owns the self-driving car software. This is a constant problem in our society. It's the human replacement trick that lets us suggest that the venture capitalists should fund me for $1 billion because I'm just going to take all that money people were making and I'm going to accumulate it all in the capital income of a company instead, which is kind of amazing, right? That we think this is ethically okay, because what we're doing is replacing people, taking away their jobs, and exacerbating wealth inequality in society all at the same time, when instead we could be designing something that just makes human drivers a little bit safer. And now that's seeing the light of day, but only because like Mercedes and Subaru and everybody else was doing that on the sly. Nothing to do with the investors, nothing to do with the entrepreneurs.
So picking up on that and on some of your comments, Dr. Vallor, as well, just before we move into audience questions, you mentioned these things that Subaru, Mercedes doing on the sly, because we're dealing with this absence of an economic imperative to drive the kinds of interventions that seem more genuinely useful to both paid and unpaid caregivers. What are next steps? What do the next steps look like if the market, as you say, is so hell-bent against supporting these kinds of innovations?
Yeah, if I had an answer to that question, right? It's like the how are you going to fix capitalism question, right? I mean, it's the same answer, right? Whatever it is, and I don't have it. But in terms of what I do think we will see is I think this is one, even more so than the driving case, but I think there are real parallels between this and the driving case. These are the areas where we don't tolerate failure for very long, right? Because the vulnerability is so obvious there. It's not like the way we've let social media algorithms gradually degrade our democratic institutions, right? That's much harder to see happening in real time. And the vulnerability is kind of abstract until it's too late. These are domains where there's a reason why these technologies keep failing to be widely adopted. And even something like, Tesla's autopilot, which has been adopted much more widely than it should be, largely on a kind of hype and personality kind of dimension. In the end, these technologies, if they don't work, they don't work. I'd like to think that eventually companies get tired of pouring venture capital into these black holes, but it doesn't feel like they ever will, right? The money somehow just keeps getting passed around to the same people, and in the end, the game keeps going. So I think the only answer really is for there to be, for one thing, increasing liabilities for companies that produce unsafe technology, and increasing kind of regulatory demands for things like not beta testing dangerous technology on publics that haven't consented, and being able also perhaps to put some weight on the professional communities that have some say in at least some of the care sectors, right? So medical professionals do have some power to dictate what happens in settings where their professional reputation and standing is at stake. So I think there's some potential for medical professionals to push back on exploitation of this idea of care in ways that don't actually benefit patients or people. But those are, I think, altogether weak medicine. We need stronger medicine, and I'm not sure what it is.
Dr. Nourbakhsh, anything to add to that?
Neither do I know the medicine answer. I agree with what Dr. Vallor said. I will talk about one thing, which is, I mean, we do have a massive demographic disaster here, and more so even in the future in a lot of developed countries around, number of people who are going to need care divided by the number of people who can give care. So yeah, this is a huge shortage problem. The right answer to the shortage problem is for more people, for the systems and structures to be designed in such a way that more people can give care. And we also have underemployment. We have, huge amounts of labor force participation rate fall in a lot of developed countries where people are just giving up on finding jobs. So we have fake, low unemployment numbers that are not even true because people are they've given up and they're stopped trying. It's also geographic disparity that's important to point out. If, again, I do a bunch of work in West Virginia, you look at West Virginia, the population density is so low that people requiring care are massively distanced from anybody who could give care. If they were to move to caregiving facilities, they move away from family and friends hours away. So they lose access to all the social constructs that are meaningful to them. And so maybe one way robotics and AI could help is if we don't think of robotics and AI as autonomous systems at all, but as telepresence systems. So just as with distance care in the medical profession, if distance caregiving in some way can be robot systems that are directly driven by human beings in other places, then maybe we get to average out the population density problems we have so more people can give care. But it's back to the capitalism question Dr. Vallor pointed out. If we're going to do any of the stuff I just said, we have to solve the problem of giving a living wage to people who are actually providing caregiving. As Barbara Ehrenreich would say, it has to go from a not living wage to a living wage. We have to solve that. Then, yeah, we can use technology to try and match people who can give care to people who need care. But we have to be able to compensate them properly. And that right now it's a kind of a fundamental problem with our market system.
I'd like to add one thing to that we haven't mentioned, which is really, really important. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot more about over the past few years. And in the book I just finished, it's a major theme. And that is also that there's not just an economic issue here. There's also a sort of a cultural valorization problem. We don't valorize care. We don't treat care as something that people of admirable social status do, right? It's very gendered, and it's treated as something that you only do if you don't have economic or educational opportunities to do something better, with the exception of a few kind of professionalized categories like medical doctors and so forth. But even again, the more respect they get, the further away from actual kind of caregiving they tend to be. So we privilege the surgeons, right, over the family care practitioners. We need to address the fact that care ought to be something that, if you do it for a living, doesn't just earn you a living wage. It earns you the kind of social respect that doing something that fundamental and that challenging and that rewarding and that vital to holding the social fabric together. If we valued care and repair differently than we do, we would not just, I think, not see the problem we have here in the care sector. I think it would affect how we're treating our environmental challenges. I think it would affect how we're treating so many of the kind of fundamental failures we have in the modern world. So I'm actually arguing we need to do something even deeper than just fix capitalism. We have to sort of revalorize care as a fundamental human skill and activity.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to a couple of questions from our audience while we still have a bit of time. So one question that came in says, it seems like whether the robot caregiver comes to fruition or not, pursuit of the promise is formative in and of itself, exacerbating inequality, reductionistic fixes, corroding human community through moral de-skilling and other things. So what do you recommend we do to foster communities of care? And I'd add to accomplish this kind of revalorization of care that can appropriately handle whatever new technology comes our way? It's another small question that I think we can both deal with in just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's maybe a hint of an answer in the question itself when it's talking about communities of care. I think there is some potential to do this kind of bottom-up work where we find better ways to valorize and reward caregiving at local levels in our local communities and build bigger and bigger networks of care. I do think eventually there has to be some sort of top-down cultural shift as well. But in the absence of that, I think you can get some sort of local movements. And as has been said, care is also very much a sort of often a local thing. It's about the connections that people share in their town or in their home or on their street. And I do think that there are ways that local networks and communities of care of all kinds could kind of start a grassroots movement to make care more fundamental to the way we measure success in a community. There's some work that's been done around kind of a movement around maintenance as opposed to growth, and thinking about repair and maintenance as part of care. So not just caring for people, but caring for things, caring for buildings, fixing things instead of throwing them into a landfill, right? I think there's ways to connect care in the context that we've been talking about to the care of the physical world and even just the care of the artifacts that we build. And I think there's some kind of movement, grassroots movement, that I would love to see begin to connect these different meanings of care in these different contexts.
I love that answer, but I love the question also because the beginning of it talks about this concept that even the pursuit of these robotic solutions erodes aspects of systems that we care about. I think that's a really interesting point. So, I've been for 28, 29 years a professor now. So I'm going to give an answer about academia. Academia valorizes something else, innovation. It valorizes technology innovation in a way that's incredibly outsized. And so I think one solution to the problem is to change the incentive structures in the academic community that help motivate what your grad students, your undergrads, your assistant professors actually work on. And hand in hand with that, you can go get a mechanical engineering degree or a robotics degree or a CS degree and not take a single class in ethics or social systems of any kind. You learn much less about social structures than if you become a physical therapist. So I think what we need is to rethink the educational underpinnings that are required of somebody who's going to invent, be part of the innovation economy in a way that actually has social impact. If it's going to have social impact, dude, you better learn about society. You better learn about sociality, about morality and ethics. So I think if we could change the course of study a little bit and change the incentive structures and what it means to get tenure, for example, what we need is for the innovation world, the innovation economy of the academic world, to actually care about innovations that are social too, innovations that help caregivers provide care and act like that's something I could do great work on, come up with a really cool way to deal with some problem, and that can land me the laudatory applause that I need from my fellow professors. And if they feel like they can actually get something good out of doing that kind of work, that would be interesting. But that means changing a little bit the educational system, what we think the prerequisites are for doing this kind of innovation work.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. This is something I've been championing for a while. That's why I started the Center for Technomoral Futures, to talk about the need for these educational norms to change. And it's not just, a lot of times we think, oh, we need to get the engineers and the computer scientists to think about ethics and history and politics and sociology. And yeah, we absolutely need technologists to understand the social landscape they're building in and for, and to incentivize that understanding as part of what it means to be a good engineer, right? You're not a good engineer, you're not a good computer scientist, but you don't understand the social settings that your stuff is going into. But it also needs to go the other way, because it's amazing how many times, I've taught philosophers and political scientists and, people who are embedded in thinking about concepts that only really change us when they're integrated into the built world. And yet there are people who are completely detached from thinking about technology, think it's just not something that they should be studying. And so they're really not understanding the concepts that they're using. They don't understand justice because they're dealing with it in such an abstract way, and they're not really understanding the way that justice is materialized in a physical engineered world. We absolutely need to build these things back together, knit these kind of severed halves of our understanding back together somehow. And I do think, the education system has to start taking on some of that work.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more audience question. And this, I think, is related to a couple of things just said, but also to some of these connections we've been making between the care sector and the integration of AI within it and other sectors of the economy and of life. So one participant writes, is it productive to consider that caregiving is an only partially commercialized domain of human interactions and might share qualities with other areas which are yet to be automated, like teaching?
Can I jump in first?
Please.
I was just going to say, teaching is another good example, but judges is another good example. I hear these weird reports by technologists saying our judges should be AI systems because they'll be more balanced and fair and colorblind or gender blind, which is total nonsense because all the corpus data is not like that. I also hear people say that soldiering should be robotic because soldiers get emotional and they kill women and children. And they're just missing the point entirely on the fact that emotion regulation actually turns out to be a really important part of making split-second decisions that are more human. So yeah, teaching is a good one. Cognitive tutors have gotten a lot of press in mathematics. Customized cognitive tutors in some schools have been shown to increase test results. Then you have this whole problem of the test results not being high veracity ways to measure anybody's learning anyway. And then I think in the best study I ever read, I followed up and called the school and they weren't even using a tutor anymore. They still were getting great results. And the reason was, the teacher changed that year too. Like, oh, well, study didn't talk about that. It just acted like the software system was to blame for the increased results. So I'm getting off topic a little bit. Yes, teaching, I think any of these social interaction systems are all kind of threatened in the same ways and they all deserve the same attention. But I think also, just harkening back to what Dr. Vallor said, it's really interesting that care and autonomous driving, mistakes cost lives in a very transparent way, in this very sudden way. And so there are places where society pushes back against mistakes and says, this is not acceptable. And as Dr. Vallor said, social media, you can change election outcomes, but that the impact that has on lives is slower. So we are willing to live with gradual deterioration of the quality of life, and we're kind of okay with it. So, the questioner is right, I think, but it doesn't necessarily give us a pathway yet. How do we deal with the same thing in teaching, which is undervalued in our society and many societies around the world? And how do we deal with the same thing in many other places where we have a high-touch social interaction that is not valued as highly as really low-touch white-collar work? And that's kind of a problem, I think, for society.
Yeah, I'll just add there's this other phenomenon that's happening, which is that as our systems get more and more starved of the public funding that they had and the support that they had from governments, 50 years ago, as these systems begin to be starved of funding and support, the quality of what you get out of those systems degrades. And what that does is get people more and more willing to accept superficial and relatively low quality machine substitutes if they promise to be at least just a little bit better than what they're getting from the starved education system or the starved care system, right? And so you get this race to the bottom that happens, but you depress people's expectations of one another so much that eventually they're willing to say, fine, just give me a robot, right? And that's the saddest thing about the trajectory of innovation that we're seeing right now. There's a writer, Cory Doctorow, who calls it the End Shitification of everything, right? And it's a pretty apt term. But what this End Shitification of our traditional institutions and systems does is create more and more acceptance of something lesser and cheaper to replace it. And I think we have to absolutely resist that move, because it's driven by economic incentives and political incentives to take away our desire and our sense of entitlement to the institutions and public systems that 50 years ago built the kinds of societies that we were most proud of as being modern, as being advanced, all these things, right? Those were always loaded and kind of imperfect claims then. But at least we had well-funded education systems that were more and more accessible to people, that created more and more social mobility. We had care systems that were getting more and more effective at recognizing different kinds of needs from different kinds of patients, right? There was real progress in the 20th century made, and that we have actually sold off. And I think it's really important for people to recognize that and put a stop to it, which requires voting.
That's a very powerful note to end on. Just in a final minute, is there any kind of takeaway or something untouched on in this past hour that you'd like the audience to hear that is not being represented elsewhere in coverage of AI and caregiving?
I just wanted to recommend another book. Simon Head is a United Kingdom author who wrote a book called Mindless years ago. And it was about Amazon warehouses and the use of AI. But if you're interested in this whole conversation of like agency, authority, and this idea of mediocrity and convenience, I think it's a really interesting and fun book to read. So that's one of many, many books you can read on the subject.
Thanks very much.
And I'll just close by picking up one of the questions in the chat. So someone asked, why don't you ask chronically ill people what they think? And this is something that we haven't talked about, is how many care technologies are developed without any actual consultation of the people who supposedly they will benefit, right? Or regulations around these technologies that aren't developed in concert with the people who are most vulnerable to these decisions one way or the other. And so I think we absolutely have to begin to honor, there's a motto that disability activists started using many years ago, nothing about us without us. And that absolutely applies here, that if you are someone who is being seen as a market for care technologies, it should be your needs and your voice that are loudest in the conversation. And right now, that's never the case.
Thank you so much for bringing that in, Dr. Vallor. I'd like to thank our panelists again, Dr. Illah Nourbakhsh and Dr. Shannon Vallor. It's been a great kickoff to this series, and we have a lot more to talk about with the integration of generative AI in healthcare and science. And I hope you'll join us for future events, please stay tuned and subscribe to the Hastings Center newsletter. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, thank you all again, and to our wonderful panelists and moderator for the incredible session. If you were unable to catch a portion of the webinar, a video recording of the session will be available later today at the Hastings Center website. This concludes our session. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you all for joining us.